What is your reaction, firstly, to the death of Kofi Annan and his impact on the world of diplomacy?
Well, indeed, it's a poignant moment. The great son of Africa has passed on, and the amount of effort that he put into, advancing the cause of peace, justice, and humanitarian concern for our fellow human beings will always be remembered. And he was clearly a thought leader in his own right. He, under his tutelage as Secretary General, the whole notion of conflict prevention gained much greater currency, the responsibility to protect, and also notions around transitional justice, dealing with the past in order to make sure that the future is an inclusive one for all members of a particular country. But he was also quite critical about the United Nations' inability to address some of the challenges that it faced. Of course, we know the situation in Rwanda, but he was particularly critical about the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, US, UK, France, Russia, and China, in terms of the way they effectively captured the collective security system of the United Nations. And this was documented in his most recent memoir, his last memoir, so to speak, A Life in War and Peace by Kofi Annan. So he has left a legacy quite clearly. Obviously not without its own levels of controversy, but we should celebrate him at this time, as a great son of Africa, and we should emulate him and encourage the next generation of Africans to step up to the plate. He also began quite young within the United Nations system, work his way up, and so young people should not be despondent that all seems to be lost, but in fact there is hope if you remain committed to your cause.
How much was he able to change or influence the structure of the UN during his time there?
Now, this was one of his primary concerns, and it's again documented in his book. He did push quite strongly for the United Nations to change the way it did things. It was because states themselves were also the perpetrators of conflict and precipitated the greatest outflow of refugees. Today, the refugee flows stand at 65 million, and the United Nations still stands on the side, not really able to address this issue. He pushed quite strongly for the United Nations to intervene and member states to intervene much more strongly, which led to the 2005 adoption of the UN doctrine of the responsibility to protect. And we are still struggling here 13 years after the fact to actually operationalize this system. It means that the nation states remain recalcitrant to, in fact, implement some of these very important ideas that would help to prevent conflicts, resolve conflicts, promote peace building, and ensure that societies are built in an inclusive way so that there is justice, and well-being for all across the countries.
What are your impressions of his peacekeeping efforts, especially here in Africa?
Look, there was a phase when he was, in fact, Under Secretary General of the United Nations, and Boutros Ghali from Egypt was then the Secretary General. And I think you're referring to the situation in Rwanda, where he was, in fact, the Under Secretary General for the Department of Peacekeeping. And we unfortunately saw this catastrophic tragedy of Rwanda unfold on our continent in 1994. And so there is a question mark as could he have done more as an individual? But in fact, he has spoken directly to this issue. And he said that at the time he felt he was doing all that he could. But in hindsight, when all the evidence was put on the table, he confessed that, in fact, not only him, he was one individual in a large bureaucracy, but also other actors, including African nation states, which should take responsibility for these sorts of crises, also faltered. And so it is a slightly checkered, record. But obviously that should not take away from the immense efforts that he undertook in other places like Kenya, where he intervened in a peacemaking process with Benjamin Mkapa and Graça Machel of Mozambique to help the Kenyans, in fact, pull back from the brink of violent conflict in 2007, 2008, following the contested election there. And that is one of the most significant, if you will, achievements as a peacemaker. So there is a balanced record there, and there is much to celebrate. Even though we obviously point out to one or two of the controversial issues that he also had to address.
What about his subsequent work after he stepped down as the Secretary General? Was he still involved in peacekeeping efforts?
Indeed, he became well. Firstly, he had his Kofi Annan Foundation, which is based in Geneva, and in fact, our Institute for Justice and Reconciliation here, based in Cape Town, has collaborated with the Kofi Annan Foundation on transitional justice issues, dealing with the past, peace and reconciliation, and we've interacted with him and his colleagues directly. And so he was quite busy with our foundation. He was also a member of the Elders, which is a group of eminent statesmen and women who would try to intervene in crises prior to their unfolding, and to prevent them from, in fact, exploding and becoming much more difficult to contain. And even it was during that time when he was appointed as a UN special envoy for Syria. But it was a very short-lived stint in the Syria operation. I think he realized that the game was much larger and required somebody with much more time to commit. So even in retirement, he was called back to serve the United Nations. And that is always a mark of a great statesman, a great leader, a great thought leader. And we should be proud as Africans that this was in fact one of our own, making an influence on the global stage.
Now, of course, these days we have a lot of loud voices on the world stage who would criticize that kind of gentle diplomacy. How effective was Kofi Annan in his personal style and in his relationships with people?
Look, the effectiveness emerged out of his ability to influence from behind the scenes. You know, he was a tough negotiator, even though he had a gentle, diplomatic, and very professional approach. And if you just see the number of issues he put on the table that we're now even still engaged in. I mentioned conflict prevention and responsibility to protect transitional justice. One has to give him credit for that. It is easier to go into a position like Secretary General of the United Nations and in fact just sit on your haunches and hope that everything will work out. But in fact, that position requires you to be proactive, to be a thought leader, to go forward and push certain agendas, even when they are not approved or they are challenged by particularly powerful states. And again, I mentioned the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. We often had to do quite a bit of diplomatic brinkmanship with in order to push certain issues onto the table. So on that basis, I think he definitely had influence across the world, and it's again evident in the fact that even after he left, he kept being called back to assist in very difficult and challenging crises that kept on unfolding in different parts of the world, not only in Africa, but also, Asia, parts of Europe as well.
Okay, Professor, thanks so much for joining us here on ENCA. That was Professor Tim Murithi of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation.